Hello. This is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. And a very warm welcome to the last regular episode for 2021 of the Film Stories podcast. Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, stories of films delayed heavily due to global pandemics, all that kind of thing, really. The films that I cover in this podcast, they're more mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films and stories I'm interested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I just celebrate the fact that films get made and celebrate the fact that people do get them made and want to salute that, really. Even though in the case of this particular episode, well, I'm going to deal with one film that got made and one film that didn't get made. Let's kick off with the first of them, though, as this is my final regular episode of the podcast for 2021. I'm going to go back and look at, arguably, well, until Spider-Man came along, the biggest release of the year that we've just had and dig properly into its story. I did a little bit on this particular film around the time of its release, but I'm going to go back a little bit more surgically now. Let me play you a clip from the film in question, the latest James Bond adventure, No Time to Die.
We used to be able to get into a room with the enemy. Now they're just floating in the ether.
When her secret finds its way out, it'll be the death of you.
Oh my God. Target enough people.
And the people become the weapon.
Who is he?
James, you don't know what this is?
James Bond, licensed to kill, in love with Madeline Swan. I could be speaking to my own reflection. Only your skills die with your body. And life is all about leaving something behind, isn't it?
Come on, Bond. Where the hell are you?
That, of course, was a clip from the 25th James Bond movie No Time to Die, released in 2021. Directed by Cary Fukunaga, the screenplay by Fukunaga, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Robert Wade and Neil Purvis, and the cast for this one led by Daniel Craig as James Bond for the final time, Rami Malek, Lea Seydoux, Lashana Lynch, Ben Whishaw, Naomi Harris, Jeffrey Wright, Christoph Waltz, Ralph Fiennes. I should point out from the off, whilst usually this podcast is spoiler free, with this one I am going to go into spoilers on it, so if you haven't seen No Time to Die, this is probably an episode to avoid. I'm not doing a massive spoilery deep dive, but we are going into bits and bobs that happen throughout the movie. So the story of this one picks up in the aftermath of 2015's divisive 24th James Bond adventure, Spectre. There were questions left after that film's release. Spectre's box office had fallen just a little way short of its predecessor Skyfall, which had set records for the James Bond franchise, the first $1 billion grossing James Bond movie in cinemas. Spectre hadn't hit that, and the response to it, whilst initially quite positive, has over time dwindled. Sam Mendes had directed Skyfall and Spectre, and it was clear he wasn't going to return for a third James Bond film. There was also the question of who's going to distribute it, because Sony Pictures had held the theatrical distribution rights to 007 since Casino Royale, and its deal was now up. And then who was going to play James Bond, because there was a very well-reported interview around the time of Spectre's release where, let's just say, Daniel Craig threw some significant doubt on whether he ever wanted to make another James Bond movie again. So, as always then, it was up to Eon Productions, headed up by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, the producers of the Bond film, to get things back up and running again. And they gave themselves just a little bit of time in the aftermath of Spectre's release before they started work on James Bond 25. And it headed into very, very early development at the start of 2016. That's when they really started working in earnest on the new adventure. Now, quite when the film was due for release, that was up in the air, that it was wanted really for about 2017, 2018, but these films seem to be taking longer and longer to make. Nonetheless, conversations were taking place with directors, and throughout the development of the film, names such as Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, David Mackenzie, Jan Demange, Kerry Fukunaga, Danny Boyle were mooted as possible helmers for the film. Now, over the course of the film's development, both Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve would over time rule themselves out. Nolan, a very singular filmmaker, making stuff that he writes and directs himself. I mean, he'd come up with Tenet that he was going to go and do anyway, but seeing him fitting within the apparatus and control of the Bond environment, that was always going to be a long shot. Denis Villeneuve was said to have been interested, but he was pursuing the idea of bringing Dune to the big screen, and that worked out really rather well. It was in March 2017, though, after a year down the track, really, that it was reported by Variety and the Daily Mail, that the writing team of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade had been approached once again to pen a James Bond movie. This would make it their 7th 007 adventure. And by this stage, there was hope in Broccoli and Wilson that actually they could bring Daniel Craig back to the franchise, that he'd never ultimately cut his ties with it. The end of Spectre just sees him walking off. You know, that it was fairly easy for him to come back, and they thought they could get him back, and they were confident that he was going to come back as well by this stage. Purvis and Wade, meanwhile, were admitting that they were facing the challenge of writing a Bond film in the light of shifting political plates, that in 2016 the Brexit vote had taken place, that Donald Trump was very firmly on the political scene, and the feeling was that they would have to reflect this. Do not worry, this is not going to turn into a political podcast. It's more the fact that they knew Bond had to reflect really the world around him, and that was what was happening in the world around him. By April 2017, the issue of who was going to distribute the film, that was resolved, that the auction came up for the distribution rights, and every major studio in Hollywood, with the exception of Disney, wanted in. In the end, a deal was struck that would split the distribution of the film between MGM's United Artists Releasing, that got the US rights for the film that would become No Time to Die. Universal Pictures would distribute it everywhere else. But by the nature of the deal, this brought with it a high required return for the film to break even. There were vested interested parties in this. It was going to be a very expensive film to make. It would need to make an awful lot of money. Now, when Spectre came around, even though that grossed, in the region of $900 million at the worldwide box office, because Sony only had theatrical rights to the film, it was said to have barely broken even on the movie. And that's how high the bar was for any kind of return on the film. Nonetheless, there was no reason not to be confident, especially if they pushed this as Daniel Craig's final James Bond adventure. And in August 2017, Craig did indeed confirm on American television that he'd been convinced and he was signing up, and this would be his last 007 film. But still, 2 years into the development of the film, we still weren't clear who was ultimately going to direct it. However, by early 2008, a frontrunner was heading to the fore of the pack, and that man was Danny Boyle. Now, Danny Boyle had crossed with the James Bond saga before that. In 2012, he had, of course, put together the opening ceremony for the London 2012 Olympics. And one of the high points of that was a sequence involving Queen Elizabeth II and Daniel Craig as James Bond. And he had directed that particular sequence. And it had brought him into the sphere of, the Eon family, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. By early 2018 then, he was very much the looking like the choice to do the film, that he wanted to bring in his regular writing collaborator, John Hodge, and they pitched their story of what they wanted to do with a new Bond film, and this was taken up. It was going to be a page one version of it, so the existing script by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade would not be used. This would be one put together by John Hodge that Boyle would direct. It's worth noting, I've interviewed Danny Boyle on this point, that Danny Boyle does not work with huge collections of writers. He believes in sticking to the writer, that the original writer does the rewrites. And if you go, and I've observed this on this podcast before, if you go through the credits of Danny Boyle movies, you will generally only see one writer listed for the screenplay. So this was going to be relatively singular, really, that Boyle would direct, Hodge would write. And so by the end of February 2018, they'd been hired and it looked like full steam ahead. The plan at that point, and it was announced, was for filming to start in December 2018, and the idea would be release the film for the end of 2019. This would still be quite a gap from Spectre to James Bond 25, but also it needed to allow Boyle to make a film he committed to make. That would be Yesterday, that I've covered before on this podcast. Nonetheless, the constituent parts of this were sliding into place. There was still the script to finish, though, that Hodge and Boyle had pitched their story. Hodge just needed to get it down on paper. And this is where the problems started really to kick in. Because the Bond world is a controlled world. That the creative oversight of it is held by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. And they've got strong views on what they want from Bond. And more often than not, they get it very right. Within months, things weren't working with the version that Hodge and Boyle were putting together, that Broccoli and Wilson were just not convinced by the script, and they wanted to bring in new writers to work on it, and Danny Boyle just doesn't work like that. There were rumours around the time that Boyle had this really wild, fantastical idea of killing off James Bond. Imagine that. And also that he was interested in casting Thomas Cott as the villain of the piece. But there were very clear differences here, and they came to a head by the middle of 2018 when it was announced that John Hodge and Danny Boyle were no longer involved in the new James Bond film. As it turned out, it would be down to script differences. This would be revealed a bit down the road, that Boyle would talk to Empire about this. And he said, I work in partnership with writers and I'm not prepared to break it up. We were working very, very well, but they didn't want to go down that route with us. So we decided to part company. Now, Boyle's never gone into detail of what his version of the film would have been. He did just tell Empire that what John Hodge and I were doing, I thought was really good. He said it wasn't finished, but it could have been really good. And he said, you have to believe in your process. And part of that is the partnership I have with a writer. And so if Hodge was going to be replaced, Boyle was going to follow him out the door. And Boyle did follow him out the door. A bit further down the line as well, the Hollywood Reporter would just add a bit more colour to the story. He said, with Boyle, there was a deviation of visions. It said his version was more tongue-in-cheek and whimsical, whereas Broccoli and Wilson wanted something more serious for Craig's final outing. This was months before filming was due to begin, and the project was in some degree of disarray. There was no way there was going to be a completed script of any quality, really, ready for the end of the year, because it was going to have to start pretty much from scratch. And so elements of Bond are built in advance, of course, that sequences take a long time to plan, and so little bits of preparatory work take place on those. But in terms of the narrative of it and just what the script looked like, that was a long way away. And so quickly, Wade and Purvis were hired back. Also brought in was Scott Z. Burns. And there was, in the midst of it all, an urgent need for a new director. Now, Cary Fukunaga had met with Broccoli and Wilson before Boyle was hired and had a conversation about it. But when it became clear Boyle was departing the project, he dropped the pair a note and asked for a meeting. And so, I mean, his career at that point was in an interesting place. He'd come onto the radar of people for with the indie hit Sin Nombre. He'd then directed a version of Jane Eyre. He had really come onto people's radars, though, with season 1 of the TV show True Detective. Now, Fukunaga was not involved with season 2 of that show, following behind-the-scenes disagreements with its showrunner, and he walked away from that. He'd also walked away from another film he was set to make, based on Stephen King's It, that he'd worked on that for several years, and then late changes led to him thinking, this isn't the film I want to make, and so he amicably walked away from that project as well, and went on to make something called Maniac with Netflix. You might have heard of that. But he had a couple of meetings with Broccoli and Wilson, and he got the Bond job. He was the new director, but before he would absolutely accept it, he dropped a note to Danny Boyle just to get Boyle's blessing on it. Boyle gave that blessing and has always refused to go into detail so as not to undermine Fukunaga. So, in September 2018, all of this came out, that the announcement, the new director came in, that a new script was underway. Paul Haggis came in, did a little bit of work on that script as well. And as it developed, by the spring of 2019, Cary Fukunaga had suggested, and Daniel Craig had suggested, that Phoebe Waller-Bridge, riding half the back of Fleabag, be brought in to do some punch-up work on the dialogue and on the screenplay. And she did so in the April of 2019, and getting a co-screenwriter credit for her work. But by this point, the film had been delayed, that it wasn't going to start shooting on time, and so they needed to buy themselves several months, really. And so the release date for a start that had been posited for the end of 2019, that initially moved to February 2020, and then it moved again to April 2020. But they were able to start crewing this one up. That they knew that for instance, they were going to shoot part of this on IMAX cameras. That they hadn't done that for Bond before. They knew they wanted to go for a big spectacle swan song for Daniel Craig. They knew what we didn't at this point as well, that this was going to be a film with a big emotional punch, with a very final ending for Daniel Craig's James Bond. And so the veil of secrecy over this one was even more pronounced than it had been over previous Bonds, and that's really saying something. By April 2019, the film was ready to go. By this point, actually, it had done a little bit of filming already that had taken place in Norway. But the modern way of doing Bond is you hold a big press announcement to announce the start of production, to reveal the cast, to reveal the title. And they headed off to Jamaica for this, around the GoldenEye estate that Ian Fleming, the Bond creator, used to live at. And the core cast and the outline plot were announced at this point. And so we knew that Rami Malek, hot off winning an Oscar for Bohemian Rhapsody, he was going to be the villain and had to learn a very squeaky little voice to do so. Ben Whishaw was going to come back. Lea Seydoux was going to come back. Something of a surprise. She'd appeared in Spectre, of course, but it wasn't a given that her story would continue from that point. Naomi Harris was back. Ralph Fiennes was back. And then in terms of new additions, Ana de Armas had been suggested by Craig. They'd just worked together on Rian Johnson's Knives Out that had appeared a few months before. Lashana Lynch, who told her, I interviewed Lashana Lynch a good year or so before the film ultimately came out, and she told me at that point she just couldn't say anything at all about her role, but it was clear she was going to have a major part to play. Jeffrey Wright was going to come back. Rory Kinnear was going to come back. Daniel Denchich was in the cast as well, and in fact his role would be beefed up as his performance was built. What wasn't revealed, though, was the title of the film. That the best guess going round the press at that point was Shatterhand, although that was fairly quickly denied. But the first plot details were that we were going to have a Bond who was retired and being pulled back into service, and that the film was going to be shooting in London at Pinewood on the Bond stages, of course. It would be shooting in Jamaica, and it would round off in Italy. One name that wasn't mentioned at that launch, in fact, interestingly, was Christoph Waltz, and this goes to what they were trying to do to keep some of the secrets of the film under wraps. The idea was Waltz would not be named in the ensemble, and it would be a surprise when he turned up in the film. But the problem with that was he was seen on the set, and the news leaked out very, very quickly, and so there was little point holding that secret much longer. I did ask Lashana Lynch how she ended up in the movie and how she came onto the radar of Barbara Broccoli, and she told me that she'd done a play at the Royal Court Theatre, that Broccoli was producing the play, and she said then she called me in for a mystery project that I didn't have a clue what it was. 2 tapes and 2 meetings later, I got the role and I got to work. But what that role was, as it would turn out, the new 007, she wasn't sure of even while she was auditioning. She said she'd had to tape herself doing M scenes for her audition, but was in the dark as to the role. And as filming got underway, tabloid reports suddenly spiked that Lashana Lynch was going to be the new 007. And so there was a press sensation going on around, and I asked Lashana Lynch what it was like making the film in the midst of all of that, and she said it felt like a lot of noise at the time that was potentially distracting from being the best actor I could be for the production. And she said that's what I wanted for myself. I don't have time for distractions that are going to be detrimental to the work that I'm doing. And she explained I stayed away from the phone, away from social media, and focused on the work. Now, one of the reasons people are able to do that on a Bond film is ultimately they are independent movies, and there is a protective veil thrown over them by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson that lots of people who've worked on James Bond films describe them as a very family-driven film, and you are part of that family and the outside world is pretty much kept out of them. And so I thought I'd ask one of the cast about this, and so I'm just going to pass you over to Naomi Harris, who's just going to talk a little bit about the impact of Barbara Broccoli and the way that she puts her James Bond films together.
Barbara is absolutely incredible. She's basically like this mother figure to absolutely everybody. Yeah. And she takes everybody under her wing, and she's so caring and so generous. Like, I mean, I know with Lashana happened to mention that she liked her coat that, you know, Barbara was wearing. The next thing that you know, Barbara has given her the coat. I was told this story by someone else on set who'd said that he was filming and he really liked the hotel, but the pillows were a bit hard. The next thing you know, Barbara's gone down to John Lewis, bought some feather pillows and brought them for him. Like, that's the kind of person she is. There is nothing too big or too small that she won't do to make everyone feel comfortable. She's an incredible, incredible woman.
And was that the same for you on day one? When you
Absolutely,
came in?
Yeah. She just always wanted to make sure that I was okay, that I was comfortable, that I was as relaxed as possible and happy as possible. And that's for everybody. It's not just for me. Like, she has an amazing ability to be so sensitive to the needs of everybody on the crew and the cast, behind the scenes, in front of the camera. It's everyone's taken care of.
Because the thing that really struck me, what Lashana said and what you're saying there as well, is you've got some of the most gigantic films of their respective years, and they're made to feel so small for you when you're making them. Is that fair?
That's really true, and that's also a testament to, you know, Sam Mendes, I have to say, because, you know, when I came in and I started this whole franchise, I was terrified because I thought, okay, it's another film, you know, that I'm taking on, and I've done some pretty big films up to now. You know, Pirates of the Caribbean was pretty darn huge, but the way that people reacted when I said that I was doing Bond was unlike anything else I've ever experienced. People were like, oh my gosh, it's Bond. And so I thought, wow, you know, this really is completely different to anything I've ever done. And so I arrived on set, I remember the first day, and just feeling like so intimidated. And Sam just made sure that it was this really intimate set, and it really did feel like making an indie movie, believe it or not. It was really a very special experience making Skyfall and Spectre, because it was so strange, because while we were making it, it did feel so intimate, and then all of a sudden it was presented to the world, and you realise like what a huge deal it is, how beloved these films are all over the world, and, you know, how significant they are. But at the time, it really did feel very intimate and like making an indie movie.
That experience I've had reflected to me by a couple of people who worked on on what would become known as No Time to Die. But the production of this one inevitably came with some peaks and troughs. And in fact, if you followed the press reports of how the filming was going of the movie, you'd think it was an ongoing disaster. Daniel Craig would express some exasperation with that, because whilst it's tricky to make these films, this was never really in fundamental trouble. The closest it got was when Craig picked up what was becoming really his traditional injury on a James Bond film. I mean, he's revealed since that basically he got through the shoot of Spectre pretty much with a broken leg. By the end of it, he was in constant pain while he was making the bulk of that film. In the case of this one, it was towards the end of May 2019 that he ended up having to have ankle surgery as a result of an injury he sustained while making the film. That ankle surgery meant also he needed 2 weeks of complete recovery time afterwards, where he couldn't be shooting sequences. The film just continued to shoot around him. There was an awful lot to capture of this one. It was not going to be a short film, as it ultimately turned out. And so things just kept going. Now, by August 2019, they were finally willing to tell us what the thing was called. And there were hints that there was something deeper going on in the movie when Barbara Broccoli admitted that they'd struggled to come up with a title that, quote, didn't give too much away. Now, it's one of those things in hindsight, having seen the film, you just think, oh, okay, maybe she was just like hinting something very lightly there. But she revealed the name was going to be No Time to Die. And the production of it continued as intense as it always was, wrapped up at the end of October 2019, and space was left to do some pickup work in December of 2019. And so it's not quite the most frantic post-production of a Bond film. I'm always taken with the fact that Spectre had 3 months start to finish from the end of production to get a final edit onto screens. This one had a little bit more wiggle room, and they had to put some action-intensive stuff towards the end after they'd had to reschedule it around Daniel Craig's injury, but it was in the can. By the end of 2019, it was done, it was shot, they'd been working on the edit, the marketing campaign could get into full swing for the movie. This was going to be one of the first big blockbusters of 2020, but of course the story was just beginning at that point, because you might have noticed things happened. And so it came to pass that at the start of 2020, we all started getting these headlines that there was this strange virus doing the rounds. This would, of course, become COVID-19, and COVID-19 has been a shadow over lots of our lives over the last year or two. And James Bond was the first major blockbuster movie to be affected by it. Now, it goes back to there were heavy financial expectations resting on this movie. And so as it became clear that COVID-19 was presenting a very, very real threat, and that ways of lives were going to have to adjust significantly in at least the short term, ahead of lots of governments around the world, the Bond producers made a call, a bold call, but it turned out to be the right call. That very late in the day, having already spent tens of millions on marketing and committed tens of millions to marketing, No Time to Die was going to be delayed to November of 2020. I remember reporting on this. This sent shockwaves. It was at this point for many people, they realised just how serious the pandemic that we were about to go through was. Daniel Craig was in the midst of rehearsals for a Saturday Night Live hosting gig when he got the call from Barbara Broccoli telling him that Bond was about to move. Lots of the cast and crew found out just hours before the official announcement came. This was done fairly late in the day. Cary Fukunaga had worked out it was going to happen, and once Bond announced it was delaying, well, pretty much every major film thereafter followed suit. Peter Rabbit 2 wasn't far behind, though those were the first two to go, and then pretty much everything went from that point. The marketing campaign was aborted, and the costs of delay started to be incurred by MGM, by Universal, by Eon. But the hope was still that by November, the world would be in a position to get the film out and for it to have a full release, which was always absolutely sacrosanct to Barbara Broccoli. She insisted right the way through this was a cinema release. It had to be a cinema release. There was no other way to do it. Now, that does not mean that there wasn't talk of a sale of the film to streaming services. At one stage, it was reported that Apple had put in a substantial bid to get the film for its own streaming service, that Eon resisted. Broccoli, again, just vetoed any idea that this may not get a cinema release. But even so, there was doubt and uncertainty, as there was for everyone at this point. Now, there was some insistence too that the film was not going to be edited at this time, that the film was complete. They'd spent their money on it. It was a done deal. It was rumoured already by this point it was going to be very, very, very long, as it ultimately turned out to be. Now, those denials that there were some edits weren't quite true, because in the ultimately 18 months that the film was delayed from its original release, there needed to be adjustments made to some of the products in the product placement in the film, that they were digitally edited before it came out. But even so, as we got to November 2020, there was a little bit of a marketing campaign spike, but again it was revealed that no, they're going to move it back to April 2021, and it was at that point, such was the impact and importance of James Bond on the cinema exhibition, that movie houses were starting to question their future, that doors were slamming shut. If there's no Bond, there's no point of staying open, and it was a gigantic deal. With each delay came a marketing campaign, another resurgence of the marketing campaign that had to be put back in mothballs. The number of clips and it's a good job the film was long, the amount of clips and trailers that they had to cut from it. And so it moved to April 2021, but again, there wasn't enough certainty. It then moved to October 2021, end of September in the UK. And stories were coming out at this point that the film was every delay was costing just $1 million here or there in interest payments, that there was coming to a point where they just simply could not financially afford to delay this film again, that it had to hit in the autumn of 2021, or they were going to have to come up with something drastic. However, this time they found their spot, and this has been recorded in December 2021, just after the day it's been announced that Britain's had record COVID cases, and so the window that they managed to hit with Bond was pretty much perfect in the current circumstances. And as it rode into cinemas in the UK at the end of September 2021, it took with it the hopes of British cinemas. They were absolutely counting on this. I'm going to go back to Naomi Harris, who can just capture just some of the launch of the movie and its premiere that was reported around the world on the 28th of September 2021 at the Royal Albert Hall, which was also the first press screening of the film as well. For reasons that would become very clear, Eon did not even press screen it for people doing interviews with the Bond cast and crew, like in the weeks in advance, and usually that is an absolute given, but not in this case. I'm going to pass you over to Naomi Harris.
Yeah, you know what? It's so funny about that, because there are so many different dates that were bandied about, about the release, and people were on tenterhooks constantly going, "When is it going to be released? When is it going to be released?" And it's so special actually, because it was released at exactly the right time.
Yeah,
it really was it was the perfect moment when people felt finally confident enough to go into the cinemas. And so I just remember, the No Time to Die premiere being so magical, actually, because it felt like a celebration, not just for us, because normally it is for us and the film and we're presenting the film, but it felt like a celebration for the whole world in a way. And it felt like everybody was involved in that celebratory moment, because it felt like the end of the nightmare that we'd all been through.
I mean, the end of the nightmare didn't quite last, but it's hard to argue with her words there. And I mean, by this point, the film had cost, $250-300 million just to get this far. It was the longest James Bond film. It was the most expensive James Bond film. And as we were about to discover when we all got to see it, it had the most daring ending of a James Bond film as well, bringing to an absolute definite end the Daniel Craig era of No Time to Die. So when the initial round of reviews came round, I mean, on the whole, they were pretty much ecstatic about the film, that people really hadn't seen the big twist at the end coming. And it's not as if there's only one major character death that we get in the movie. And so the reviews were really, really strong. And it was just music to the ears of cinemas who were once again opening their doors really early in the morning and really late at night, just so people could see this film. The movie then blasted into UK cinemas with the kind of huge number that hadn't been seen this side of, since the pandemic came into our lives. And there was a real feeling that cinema was back in earnest. What didn't happen was for that to be fully reflected in the US when it opened there a week or two after the UK. But then there was a strange inversion going on because the sequel Venom Let There Be Carnage had moved into the slot in the US where No Time to Die had sat in the UK and had mopped up far more money than it was expecting. And so we then got Venom Let There Be Carnage after No Time to Die here in the UK, and it was No Time to Die that dominated the box office. Both films did particularly well, but the comparisons were numerous. It was compared against Spectre and Skyfall, where in the UK it compared favourably. In the US it didn't, and in fact the US release of the movie, which came on October the 8th 2021, whilst it opened with a sizable 23 million on its opening day, and its opening weekend, brought in, again, a substantive opening weekend of $55 million. That was actually quite a way behind what Venom had managed just a week before. I wonder if there was a little bit of impact there on the fact that the key spoiler for the movie it had emanated from the UK fairly quickly. I don't think you can do something as dramatic as they do at the end of No Time to Die and it not get out, even though the cast and crew kept the secret for an awful long time. The movie, though, would go on to take 160 million to date in the US and another 610 million worldwide. And so its worldwide gross is coming at $771 million. Now, there were reports going around at the time that the film needed to really get to about 900 million to break even just off its theatrical run. It didn't quite do that. And there are reports going around that the film off its theatrical run has lost $100 million. I would imagine there's a degree of Hollywood accounting going on there, but also at the point this has been recorded, the film is is coming out on home formats, has already been on digital formats, and so that loss has long since been absorbed. Now, one person who didn't get to experience the premiere and the UK launch of the film was Billy Magnussen, who takes on, again, a key role in the movie. But he got to see it in the US, and even over there, he was talking about the impact that he felt of the film. Here's what he said to me.
While shooting the film, I didn't understand the gravitas of what was going on. And now being outside of it, it being coming out to reveal it. Because again, it's been 3 years almost since we shot it. You do feel a palpable energy moving towards you as you move through the world a little bit more.
And he did manage to get to see the film with a crowd in the end. And he just touched on that for me as well.
I went to see a screening and it felt very empty. Like, it was exciting to watch the project, I see the amazing work that Carrie created and put on screen. It was absolutely exciting. But I was a little bit like, a little underwhelmed about the, I didn't get to celebrate with everyone that I worked with about, on the film to see it come to fruition. But then I had a group of buddies, it was like 20 people invited me out, and we went to the Chinese theater and watched it with a real audience. And I had my own little mini premiere, and it was like, I can't be more grateful for the friends I had that did that. But it was crazy to see the energy and the excitement that people have surrounding the Bond films. It's really a beautiful, beautiful, I don't know, art piece. I don't know. I don't have the words to describe the joy I have for it.
Just as this podcast episode is being recorded, the records that were set this year by No Time to Die have just been smashed in UK cinemas by the new Spider-Man film, Spider-Man No Way Home. However, the importance of No Time to Die to 2021 cinema, whether you like the film or don't like the film, I've seen it a couple of times, it just can't be understated. It was a shot in the arm for the exhibition business. It brought droves of people back to the big screen. It ignited discussion about the movies. And whilst it left lots of people sitting through the end credits to see if James Bond really will return, it's also gone to show that there's really appetite still for this character, that there's appetite for big blockbuster films. It's just going to be really interesting where they take this one next. Which brings me to just past the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Just a couple of requests as always. I'm going to get through these quick because I'm hopelessly overrunning. If you like this podcast and wish to support it, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew. And thank you to everybody who backs me there. You get the podcasts early. You get lots of gossip of what's going on behind the scenes at Film Stories. And also your money, it doesn't actually go into my pocket. It helps pay writers for our website and bring new writers through. And so I thank so much everyone who has supported that. It's patreon.com/Simon Brew. To the people too who have support, to all of you for listening, I hugely appreciate that. If you can possibly subscribe to the podcast, that helps a little independent like me enormously. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that also really, really helps. And again, because I'm an independent, because I don't have big marketing budgets or marketing budgets, let's just call it that, it's things like that have really helped this podcast get to where it is, and I can't thank you enough for it. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films, though, I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. And I've done this once before. I'm doing it again. I'm going to talk about a film that ultimately didn't get made. And this one's got a James Bond link as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a clip from 2002's James Bond movie Die Another Day that I've covered before on this podcast. In this clip, you hear Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. You hear Halle Berry as Jinx. And I'm going to come to the story that involves the latter of those characters the other side of this clip.
Magnificent view.
It is, isn't it? Too bad it's lost on everybody else.
Mojito? You should try it.
Jacinta Johnson. My friends call me Jinx.
My friends call me James Bond. Jinx, you say?
Born on Friday the 13th.
You believe in bad luck?
Let's just say my relationships don't seem to last.
I know the feeling.
So what we've got there is a clip from Die Another Day, but actually I'm talking about a film called Jinx, which was not starring Halle Berry, but was certainly supposed to at one point. And what Jinx was a film that would have spun out the character played by Halle Berry in Die Another Day. So it was around the time when Tomorrow Never Dies hit, when Eon had the idea of basically, I mean, by this point it's successfully rebooted James Bond again with Pierce Brosnan. Tomorrow Never Dies, of course, was Brosnan's second 007 adventure. And so it had a serious look at that point of spinning off a second run of films, in particular based around the character Wei Lin, played by Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies. That it had a look at that point about giving her a vehicle of her own. Now, there was talk at one point of Michelle Yeoh actually coming back for Die Another Day, and the story goes that when she was unavailable or didn't want to do so, that's where the character Jinx came from. Also, Eon at this point was up against the possibility of another unofficial James Bond film coming to life, that Kevin McClory was, who the co-author of Thunderball, the co-writer of the Thunderball movie, had the rights to remake Thunderball. He'd done so once with Never Say Never Again. He was threatening to do so again. And so, I mean, in the early 80s, there was the year where there were two Bond films head-to-head at the box office. The official one, which was Octopussy with Roger Moore, then Sean Connery's return to Never Say Never Again, and Eon didn't want this. And it sort of made sense for it to have another Bond line of its own, partly to mitigate the risk of that happening. Now, 2002's Die Another Day may not be the most fondly remembered James Bond movie, but it's easy to overlook the fact that it was a huge, huge, huge success. That the box office of Pierce Brosnan Bond adventures had been growing, and this really, I mean, it was just assumed by the time we got to the end of Die Another Day that Pierce Brosnan would be back for another James Bond film. It was also part of growing the film, the series' international fan base, which Eon had made an overt attempt to do. particularly breaking into the American market by, for 3 films in a row, casting an American actor in a prominent role. So we got Terry Hatcher, albeit briefly, in Tomorrow Never Dies. We got Denise Richards more prominently as Dr. Christmas Jones in The World Is Not Enough. And then Halle Berry turned up in Die Another Day with a significant role, just at the point, actually, where she was about to be Oscar nominated and win for the film Monsters Ball, an independent film she'd made that got an awful lot of traction. She was on set when she learnt of her Oscar nomination for that. So Halle Berry was in demand. That she was cast in this film, which gave her some blockbuster profile as well. She was in the X-Men films. There was Swordfish. I've covered Swordfish before. And so with Berry signed up and the early sign that her Jinx character was going to be a really strong one, Eon and MGM then knocked their heads together to seriously explore doing a spin-off film again at this point. That it was taking 2 to 3 years to make a James Bond film, and the idea was, what if they had a spin-off series of films that could alternate in the off years? That it was described in a couple of quotes as the Winter Olympics version of the James Bond movies. Now, even on the press rounds for Die Another Day, Berry was absolutely open to the idea of reprising the character of Jinx, how she'd return to the character like a shot, and this was music to the ears of MGM at that point, and it was interested to the point that after counting all the money from Die Another Day, in 2003, it pressed forward with this. It decided to pursue the idea of a Jinx movie. As such, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who you'll be familiar from the No Time to Die story, long-time James Bond screenwriters, they were called in to do a screenplay for this. They had a meeting with Halle Berry at the home of Bond producer Barbara Broccoli. And by May of 2003, and I'm grateful to my Film Stories colleague Mark Harrison for doing a lot of the digging on this, they'd come up with a first draft story of where the character of Jinx would be the whole film really would be a down and dirtier version of a Bond film. It would lean into the influence of the Jason Bourne film, that it would have more of a European edge to it, and it would just be a bit grittier at the point where the Brosnan-led Bond franchise had gone a bit sci-fi. Die Another Day, of course, being infamous as the Invisible Car movie. So they developed this character of Jinx a bit more, that she would do work for the NSA. She'd be in a relationship with a man called Javier, and the idea was Javier Bardem would be asked if he was interested in the role. He would, of course, go on to take a role in the Bond franchise a bit further down the line. And it got to the point where directors were being sounded out, that the script was ready, and this looked like it was going to go. Now, one person who was interested in the job was Lee Tamahori. He had directed Die Another Day. He'd basically introduced the character of Jinx on the screen and was keen to have another go, really, and to take on the other film. MGM, meanwhile, it was fast-tracking the idea of just getting this made and released. It was looking at a winter 2004 release date early on in its plans, but with the screenplay in hand in May of 2003, that actually looked viable. The screenplay was passed to Berry. She took delivery of it. She liked it. She was still open to this, and she played down in interviews around that time. She was doing some promotional work at that point, the idea of this being a female James Bond film, but also was talking up its links to the franchise, that Michael Madsen would have returned from Die Another Day in the role of Damien Falco, and this was pressing ahead. Now, Lee Tamahori, from what I can see, never really got too close to getting the job of directing the Jinx film, but instead a different high-profile director came into its orbit. So by June of 2003, so a few months into the development of this, it was well known that the film was becoming a thing. It was being reported on James Bond fan sites around the world, that questions were being asked about it. There was a scheduling problem in that Halle Berry had committed to another big movie. That big movie would be Catwoman, and she was looking to shoot that first and then would come on to do the Jinx film afterwards. That meant an end of 2004 release wasn't possible. Instead, the idea was they'd fit in the filming of Jinx in the middle of 2004 with a view to releasing it as early as summer 2005. Now, this had a knock-on for James Bond because the 21st James Bond film was also on the radar, and ordinarily that would have been expected to land in 2005, and so it was looking more at that stage that it was going to happen in 2006. Director-wise, it was Stephen Frears who then became the top choice. I mean, he'd just done Dirty Pretty Things. He's obviously got films like The Grifters in his back catalogue. He wasn't an obvious choice for a blockbuster. He'd gone to a big studio star-driven blockbuster before with the film Mary Riley that had been quite a troubled movie. But still, I mean, Frears is undoubtedly excellent at directing actors and could bring something different to it. And so, and let's not forget too that Michael Apted had been hired to direct The World Is Not Enough, and so Eon Productions knew if you get people who are good in with drama, there are second unit people who can do all the action stuff. So Frears in that context looked like quite an inspired choice, and he was certainly interested as well. That he met with Halle Berry, he liked her, he liked the character, and MGM was to the point where it started budgeting the movie and was figuring this was going to cost around $80 to $90 million to make. Now that's much cheaper than a James Bond film, but also that's very expensive for an action movie that was, I hate to say it, that headlined by a woman, because Hollywood wasn't good with this in the early 2000s. There's an argument Hollywood isn't great with it now, but that was the kind of thing that was raising questions at this point, and it was felt that there was a large degree of risk associated with having a female-led action movie heading into cinemas, even one tied to the James Bond franchise. And so it was against that backdrop that even though development work was continuing, the ecosystem around the Jinx film was starting to cause problems. And in particular, it was said to be the 2003 box office numbers that really just gave MGM the collywobbles on this one. Now, it's worth noting that MGM was never the cash-rich studio of old in the 2000s. I've covered lots of times on this podcast how MGM as a studio has bounced several times close to bankruptcy, delaying films like The Hobbit. It had an enormous impact on the production of Skyfall, the fact that MGM was in such a fragile state. And so it wasn't massively cash rich in 2003, but still Bond was one of its surefires. Nonetheless, it got spooked. And it got spooked when female-led films did not do brilliantly or live up to expectations at the 2003 box office. So, Kill Bill did okay, but that wasn't playing into the same market as Bond. The thriller Gothica did all right, but again, not quite what had been hoped. But I wonder if the one that really, really gave it the spooks was Charlie's Angels Full Throttle. Because Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, a big blockbuster sequel, the follow-up to a hit movie, and when that landed in the summer of 2003, the McGee-directed film, headed up by Lucy Liu, Drew Barrymore and Cameron Diaz, fell short of the box office of its predecessor. It just scraped past $100 million at the US box office, and whilst it was an okay international hit, the feeling was that that particular bubble had burst. The Charlie's Angels franchise certainly took a long time to come back to the big screen, and confidence in female-led action movies, which hadn't been sky high in the first place, was now back to roughly where it was before the first Charlie's Angels film had gone on to be such a success. This then caused meetings at MGM, and as Chris McGurk, who was at MGM, told the excellent book Some Kind of Hero, penned by Matthew Field and AJ Chowdhury, that this was the moment where it got cold feet. And this was also the point where, as quickly as it had started work on the Jinx film, it pulled the plug. I mean, this was a story that basically, start to finish, is a matter of months. That McGurk told the book that the studio ended up killing the movie because we were just too nervous that A, it wasn't going to work, and B, it would have a very negative impact on the franchise if it didn't work. The confidence in the film had been eradicated. Now, this wasn't said to be down to the script, because most interviews I've read to do with Purvis and Wade's script suggest that it was, at worst, perfectly fine, that they knew their way around this. This was their world, and this had the potential to be a good spin-off movie. But First of all, MGM didn't have an awful lot of money, and so gambling 80 to 90 million on something when the box office numbers for what it considered comparable movies were suffering, well, that was one thing. But then the thought of in any way harming its golden goose, the James Bond movies, that ultimately made it a no-go. And so in October 2003, the plug was suddenly and brutally pulled. As Variety reported, MGM contacted Eon and said it just wasn't going ahead with the spin-off, and Eon never saw this coming. Even the reports at the time were just saying things like, much to the dismay of Bond producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson. And another report said there were creative differences, said a spokesperson acidly. MGM instead told Eon that it had to focus on the next James Bond movie instead, to completely forget the Jinx film. And the idea then was get the 21st James Bond film going in cinemas for 2005. At that point, Pierce Brosnan being the incumbent 007. It is said that the creatives at Eon were absolutely devastated by this, that it was a purely MGM decision. And I mean, Eon did have it within them to potentially shop the project elsewhere, but ultimately elected not to, and did begin work on the 21st James Bond movie. That would be Casino Royale. They knew at this stage it was going to be Casino Royale. They didn't know at that point Daniel Craig was going to be taking over the role of James Bond. But again, that's a story I've told in a previous episode of the podcast. Instead, Halle Berry had always held the door open for this. That in 2005, she gave an interview where she just said, even though that this has gone, she would be up for reprising the character of Jinx in a future James Bond movie. And in fact, she's just recently made her directorial debut with a film called Bruised, which is on Netflix now. And she did an interview with Digital Spy for that, where she talked about that whole period when she thought the film was going to go and then it didn't. She said it was very disappointing. And she said of the film, it was ahead of its time. Nobody was ready to sink that kind of money into a black female action star. They just weren't sure of its value. That's when we were then. And when Jinx fell apart, Berry instead, she already had another role in a spin-off blockbuster movie, and that was Catwoman. And it would be fair to say that didn't pay off particularly well. The idea of doing a Catwoman movie had been doing the round since Tim Burton's 1992 sequel Batman Returns, where Michelle Pfeiffer played the role, and the idea was that Burton and Pfeiffer would do a spin-off film there. That never happened. By the time Berry took on the role, it would of course win Golden Raspberry Awards. Horrible awards those are, but nonetheless, that I only mention them because Berry was open arm in her acceptance of that award and recognised it as well. And she would say also that one of the reasons she took on a role in 2017's Kingsman sequel was for finally get to play around in the James Bond style of sandbox. Looking back now, there is a feeling that Jinx was a moment, and perhaps, well, it was a missed opportunity to try something. And I mean, the first half of this podcast was about a James Bond film that has taken a very, very bold step, and there are questions now over where that leaves the future of the franchise. To think that it was not dissimilar questions over the future of the franchise that sunk this particular spin-off against that concept feel a little bit baffling. Berry is building a directorial career now, and she's built up an impressive catalogue of roles. This just feels like an interesting one that got away. And that brings me to the end of this final Film Stories episode for 2021. I thank you so much for your support. If I've not completely bored you to death, you can find more of me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. The website is going to keep going over the Christmas period, just very, 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 very loosely at filmstories.co.uk. But there's so many features and film stories on there waiting to be explored. You can support us at store.filmstories.co.uk, where all of our print magazines are available, including Film Stories Junior, our magazine for young film fans. Really proud of that. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories, and of course it's patreon.com/simonbrew. The most important thing though, and I always end the episodes with this, but I do really mean it, is that you're well and you're safe and that you're okay. I know the world is a funny place at the moment, and it's one of the reasons I cling to movies and love movies so much. You all look after yourselves. You all have a terrific festive season. To those of you who are going through tough times at the moment, I send you a hug over podcast airwaves, if you like. And I wish you the very best. I hope you all find some light and just some happiness just over the next week or two. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Thank you so much for your support and the very best to you. Bye-bye.
We have all the time in the world, time enough for life to unfold all the precious things